Johnny Carson spent 30 years sitting across from the biggest stars in the world. Every major name in Hollywood passed through that Tonight Show couch. And because of his position, the most watched man on American television, the man whose approval could launch a career and whose disapproval could quietly end one, people told him things they never said on camera. He collected that information the way other people collect stamps. And what he collected, across 3 decades at the center of the American entertainment industry, was a private accounting of the stars whose racial attitudes he found indefensible. This is the complete list. 25 names. We are going through all of them. Stay until the end. Because number 1 said everything out loud, on the record, to a national publication, and America loved him anyway. Number 25. Eddie Cantor. When Eddie Cantor's name surfaced in industry conversations during Carson's era, it carried a particular kind of discomfort. Because Cantor had built one of the most extraordinary careers in American entertainment history. By the peak of his radio years, his program reached 40 million listeners a week, making him one of the most widely heard voices in the country. He received a Special Academy Award for distinguished service to the film industry. He raised money for Jewish refugees during World War II. By nearly every standard measure, he was one of the good ones. What America chose not to examine was the foundation of that career. From his earliest days in vaudeville through his biggest Broadway successes, including Kid Boots and Whoopi, Cantor regularly performed in blackface, darkening his skin, exaggerating his lips, and rolling his eyes in a caricature of black identity that white audiences found reliably entertaining. He was not playing a black character in any dramatic sense. He was putting on dark makeup and mocking black identity for laughs. Carson grew up listening to Cantor's radio show as a boy in Nebraska and understood the contradiction better than most people in the industry. A former producer recalled Carson observing that Cantor could write a check to a charity with one hand and paint his face dark with the other, and see no conflict between the two. That the ability to help people while simultaneously mocking their identity for profit was something only a man who did not truly see black people as equals could sustain across an entire career. Carson's conclusion was direct. Being generous and being racist were not mutually exclusive. Hollywood had been using one to excuse the other for as long as the industry had existed. Number 24. Sterling Hayden. 6'5", Silver Star for bravery under fire. Decorated service in the Marines and the Office of Strategic Services during World War II. Sterling Hayden was exactly the kind of man Hollywood celebrated as the genuine article. His performances in The Asphalt Jungle, Johnny Guitar, and his unforgettable turn as the unhinged General Jack Ripper in Dr. Strangelove established him as one of the most credible presences in American cinema. Carson respected the service record entirely. What Carson could not respect was the 1951 testimony. What Carson returned to repeatedly in private was not the testimony itself, it was what came after. Because throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, Hayden publicly positioned himself as a man consumed by guilt. His 1963 autobiography, Wanderer, contained passages of open anguish about the shame he carried for betraying colleagues. Critics praised his honesty. The industry received it as a kind of redemption narrative. A former staff member recalled Carson's response. Hayden received standing ovations for feeling guilty, while the people he had destroyed were still trying to find work. Hollywood was the only industry in the world where you could ruin someone's life, write a bestseller about how badly you felt, and end up more famous than you were before. Carson told Ed McMahon directly, "The tears in Hayden's autobiography did not feed the families of the people whose careers he had ended. Regret without restitution was just another performance." Number 23. Bob Hope. Carson considered Bob Hope a friend. He admired the talent genuinely and without reservation. The USO performances, the Academy Awards hosting record, the honorary congressional recognition, Carson understood all of it for what it represented. What Carson also knew was that Hope had built a significant portion of his comedy legacy on something considerably less admirable. The road to franchise ran 7 films across 22 years, from 1940 to 1962. Road to Morocco, Road to Singapore, Road to Bali, Road to Hong Kong. Each installment treated a different non-white culture as the structural punchline. A former producer recalled Carson discussing the road films during a private dinner in the late 1970s. His observation was precise. Hope was funny enough to sell out Madison Square Garden without a single drop of makeup. Choosing to mock other cultures when you had that kind of talent was not comedy. It was cruelty dressed up in a punchline. Number 22. Dorothy Lamour. Dorothy Lamour appeared in nearly every road film alongside Hope and Crosby, from 1940 through 1962, becoming best known for the sarong she wore picture after picture, while portraying exotic island women in stories set across Asia, the Pacific Islands, and North Africa. What placed Lamour on Carson's list was not simply that she appeared in those films, but the nature of her participation and the absence of any reflection on it. Lamour played Polynesian women. A former colleague recalled Carson, noting that Lamour was a genuinely warm person who had probably never thought twice about what those films were actually saying, and that the most culturally embedded kind of prejudice was the kind so thoroughly normalized that the people perpetuating it did not even register it as prejudice. That observation is more damning than outright condemnation. It means the industry built a machine efficient enough that the participants inside it never needed to examine what the machine was producing. Number 21. Gary Cooper. Gary Cooper won 2 Academy Awards. His performances in High Noon, Sergeant York, and For Whom the Bell Tolls made him the screen embodiment of quiet, moral courage. The man who stood alone against injustice, who did the right thing when it was dangerous, who represented the backbone of American decency. The image was that complete and that consistent. 23 October 1947 cracked it. Cooper appeared before the House Un-American Activities Committee, not because he was subpoenaed, not because he was threatened. He appeared voluntarily as a friendly witness, testifying that he had turned down scripts he believed contained communist propaganda and lending one of Hollywood's most trusted faces to the committee's legitimacy at a moment when that legitimacy was actively destroying people's careers. A former producer recalled Carson's summary. Cooper played a man in High Noon who stood alone against an entire town and then cooperated with the very people destroying innocent careers. Cooper proved that you could play a hero every day of your life on screen and still be a coward when it actually counted. We are at number 20, and the names are about to become more recognizable and significantly more uncomfortable. If you have been watching until now, make sure you are subscribed. The entries ahead, particularly numbers 7, 4, and 1, are the reason this list exists. Number 20. Mickey Rooney. By the late 1930s, Mickey Rooney was the #1 box office draw in the entire country. More popular than Clark Gable, more popular than anyone in Hollywood. He performed since childhood, eventually appearing in over 300 films across nearly 9 decades. The range, the endurance, the raw natural talent. Carson acknowledged all of it without reservation. He also acknowledged what Rooney chose to do with it. Rooney never expressed regret. From blackface in 1939 to grotesque Asian caricature in 1961, he spent more than 2 decades demonstrating that mocking other races was not a youthful error or a product of ignorance, but a calculated creative choice, repeated deliberately across a career. Carson's assessment, recalled by a former producer, was measured and devastating. Rooney had more raw talent in his little finger than most actors had in their entire body. It was a tragedy that he wasted so much of it on the cheapest, cruelest kind of humor available. A man that talented did not need to mock anyone's race to make an audience laugh. The fact that he chose to do it anyway told you everything about what he thought of the people he was mocking. Number 19. Kate Smith. Kate Smith's rendition of God Bless America became so completely identified with American patriotism that the New York Yankees played it during every seventh-inning stretch. The Philadelphia Flyers erected a statue of her outside their arena. Ronald Reagan awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom. For millions of Americans, Kate Smith was literally the sound of the country. Carson's observation, recalled by a former colleague, was as direct as any he made about anyone on this list. Smith sang "God Bless America" to stadiums full of people, and nobody ever asked which Americans she was blessing. The fact that she could record songs mocking black orphan children and still be celebrated as the voice of America for 50 years told you everything about which Americans this country was built to protect and which ones it was built to ignore. Number 18. Bing Crosby. Bing Crosby sold more records than any solo performer who ever lived. His recording of White Christmas remains the best-selling single in history. His Academy Award-winning portrayal of Father O'Malley in Going My Way made him the warm, reliable voice that carried America through the Depression and the war years. The image was one of complete wholesome comfort. Multiple documented sources describe a markedly different private record. He did not return until they were removed and replaced with white performers. Staff members at Paramount documented that Crosby demanded separate craft services whenever minority crew members were present on his sets. Carson witnessed Crosby's discomfort directly during a 1976 Tonight Show appearance, watching him visibly redirect the conversation whenever it moved toward civil rights. A former producer recalled Carson's summary afterward. Crosby sang about peace on earth every December and refused to stand on the same stage as a black musician every January. The distance between the man's image and the man himself was the widest gap in the history of American entertainment. Number 17. Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers was by any serious measure one of the most gifted comedic actors the 20th century produced. His range in Dr. Strangelove alone, 3 distinct characters, 3 completely different registers, remains a technical achievement unmatched in the genre. The Pink Panther series built a comedy franchise around his ability to transform entirely into character. He had, in Carson's assessment, more comedic talent than almost anyone who had ever lived. In 1968, Sellers appeared in The Party, directed by Blake Edwards, playing Harundi V. Bakshi, an Indian actor accidentally invited to a Hollywood party. Sellers performed the role in full brown face, with darkened skin, an exaggerated accent, and physical mannerisms designed to portray Indian people as fundamentally out of place in Western civilization. An entire culture reduced to a punchline, delivered by a genius who had no shortage of other options. Carson's response, recalled by a former Tonight Show staff member, when a genius chooses to mock someone's race, the choice is worse than when a mediocre comedian does it, because the genius had 1,000 other options and chose the cruelest one. Number 16. George Murphy. George Murphy appeared in films like Broadway Melody of 1938, and For Me and My Gal, alongside Judy Garland, during his years as one of MGM's most popular musical performers. In 1964, he became one of the first Hollywood actors to transition into national politics, winning a United States Senate seat in California. He almost immediately began using that position to oppose civil rights legislation. Carson's observation, recalled by a former producer, Murphy danced with Judy Garland on screen and then went to Washington and voted to keep black Americans out of the places where Judy Garland movies were shown. Using the goodwill you earned as an entertainer to take away other people's rights was one of the most cynical things a human being could do with their fame. Number 15. Frank Sinatra. The public record on Sinatra and race is genuinely complicated, and that is precisely what made him interesting to Carson. On camera, Sinatra was one of the most outspoken white entertainers of his generation on questions of racial equality. He championed Sammy Davis Jr.'s career when virtually no other white star would associate professionally with a black performer. He performed at fundraisers connected to the 1963 March on Washington. He publicly supported Martin Luther King Jr. He refused to stay at a hotel in Australia because it would not admit black guests. He ran Rat Pack performances at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas that were among the few integrated shows in the city during the segregation era. A former Tonight Show producer recalled Carson telling Ed McMahon that Frank does the right things for the wrong reasons sometimes, and that the complexity of that contradiction troubled Carson perhaps more than straightforward bigotry would have. Because at least a straightforward bigot was being honest about who he was. Number 14. Jack Warner. Jack Warner ran Warner Brothers Studios for over 4 decades, producing films from Casablanca to My Fair Lady, and was one of the small group of men who literally built the modern Hollywood studio system. He was himself Jewish and had experienced anti-Semitism firsthand. His studio produced films that directly confronted social injustice. He understood discrimination through personal experience. Carson's observation, recalled by a former producer, men like Warner decided which stories America was told and which faces America saw. For 40 years, the decision was that black faces belonged in the kitchen, in the fields, or nowhere at all. That kind of power, exercised that consistently, did not merely reflect what the country believed, it shaped it. Number 13. Spencer Tracy. No actor in Hollywood accumulated a more consistent filmography of anti-racism roles. Bad Day at Black Rock in 1955 confronted anti-Asian racism. Inherit the Wind in 1960 defended intellectual freedom against mob conformity. Judgment at Nuremberg in 1961 examined the moral failures that enabled the most extreme racial persecution in history. And Guess Who's Coming to Dinner in 1967, released months after Tracy's death, became the most celebrated anti-racism film of its era. With his final monologue about love, mattering more than race, considered one of the most genuinely moving speeches in American cinema. Spencer Tracy won 2 consecutive Academy Awards for Best Actor. Humphrey Bogart said he was the best they had because he could do it all. The man whose entire filmography argued that race should not matter needed to evaluate a black Oscar winner before he was comfortable working alongside him. Carson's summary, recalled by a former colleague, Tracy taught America what moral courage looked like on screen, and then went home and lived like a man who had not fully learned the lesson himself. The most dangerous kind of hypocrisy is the kind the hypocrite genuinely does not see in himself. Number 12. Katharine Hepburn. Katharine Hepburn built her legend on independence. She wore trousers when women were expected to wear dresses. She spoke her mind when actresses were expected to smile and say nothing. She won 4 Academy Awards. When she starred alongside Tracy in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner in 1967, she delivered a performance passionately arguing against racial prejudice and won her 2nd Oscar for it. Biographers documented a woman whose comfort with black colleagues was more theoretical than instinctive. Someone who believed in equality as a principle while maintaining personal distances, suggesting the belief had not fully penetrated her actual behavior. Carson, recalled by a former producer, observed that Hepburn could deliver a speech about equality that would bring you to tears and then walk into a room where you could see her calculating who belonged there and who did not. And the calculation was not always based on talent. Number 11. Lucille Ball. Lucille Ball was the most important woman in the history of American television. The star of I Love Lucy, the first woman to run a major production studio, the person who fought CBS to keep her Cuban husband Desi Arnaz as her on-screen partner when the network considered an interracial marriage too controversial for American living rooms, a fight that required real courage and real professional sacrifice, which Carson respected completely. What Carson found troubling was what Ball did with the power that fight gave her. Carson's assessment, recalled by a former producer, Ball fought harder than anyone in television to put an interracial marriage on screen, and then used that same power to ensure no black family ever appeared in her neighborhood. Choosing which people deserve equality based on what is convenient for your career is not progressivism, it is politics. And Ball was always better at politics than she wanted anyone to know. Number 10. Robert Taylor. Robert Taylor was one of MGM's biggest leading men throughout the 1930s and 1940s. Matinee idol looks, reliable box office, the kind of screen presence audiences trusted because he projected decency and strength in equal measure. He held membership in the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, alongside John Wayne and other figures who used anti-communist politics to enforce racial hierarchies in the entertainment industry. A former producer recalled Carson's summary. Taylor destroyed people's lives to protect his own career and never lost a minute of sleep over it. The blacklist was never really about communism. It was about keeping certain people quiet and keeping certain other people in power. Number 9. Joan Crawford. What made Crawford's entry on this list categorically different from almost everyone else was that she put it in writing as a legal contractual demand. A contract clause from the 1940s, discovered decades later in Warner Brothers archives, explicitly stated that Crawford would not appear in scenes with black performers in equal status roles. This was not an unspoken preference, not a quiet arrangement managed by a cooperative producer. It was a written legal document shaping the casting and scripting of every film she made for years. Carson's observation, recalled by a former producer, most racists at least had the decency to keep it verbal. Crawford was so committed to her prejudice that she put it in a legal document and made other people enforce it for her. Number 8. Lee J. Cobb. Lee J. Cobb delivered one of the most celebrated performances in American cinema as juror number 3 in 12 Angry Men, a 1957 film about justice, prejudice, and the courage required to stand alone against a crowd. His portrayal of the angry, irrational holdout who eventually, painfully accepts that his own prejudice has blinded him, earned a permanent place in the history of American screen acting. Carson's summary, recalled by a former colleague, Cobb played a man who found the courage to stand alone against prejudice and then named 20 colleagues to a government committee because he was too afraid to stand alone himself. Hollywood gave him awards for pretending to have courage he never actually possessed. Number 7. Jimmy Stewart. Jimmy Stewart was, by nearly universal agreement among audiences and critics, the most beloved actor in the history of American cinema. It's a Wonderful Life, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. The performances were so morally complete, the screen persona so consistently decent, that the line between actor and character had effectively disappeared. Audiences believed Jimmy Stewart was George Bailey because he had made them believe it for decades. In 1957, Stewart signed a public petition opposing the integration of Los Angeles public schools. Carson, recalled by a former producer, George Bailey, spent an entire film fighting for the little guy. Jimmy Stewart spent his real life fighting against him. That contradiction was the saddest thing about old Hollywood because it proved a man could play decency every day on screen and never once let it touch who he actually was. Zanuck. In 1947, he produced Gentleman's Agreement, Gregory Peck, Best Picture Oscar, anti-Semitism as its central subject. In 1949, he produced Pinky, a film about a light-skinned black woman passing as white. Both pictures established Zanuck as a producer willing to challenge racial attitudes head-on. Dorothy Dandridge documented the limitations she faced at Fox under Zanuck's leadership, despite being one of the most talented performers in Hollywood. Carson, recalled by a former producer, Zanuck won Oscars for making films about racism and then went back to his office and ran his studio the exact same way those films said was wrong. Making a movie about injustice is not the same as fighting injustice if you go home and practice the very thing you just put on screen. Number 5. Walter Brennan. 3 Academy Awards for Best Supporting Actor, 1936, 1938, 1940. A record in that category that has never been matched. Over 200 film and television appearances, a warmth on screen so natural that audiences felt they were watching their own grandfather. Brennan's biographer, Carl Rollison, documented the full extent of his beliefs in a 2015 book published by the University Press of Mississippi. Brennan believed the Watts civil unrest should have been stopped with military force. Carson, recalled by a former Tonight Show staff member, "Whatever your politics, celebrating the murder of a man who spent his life fighting for other people's dignity tells you everything about the darkness in your own soul. 3 Oscars do not entitle you to dance on the grave of a man who was better than you could ever hope to be." Number 4. Dean Martin. The coolest man in America. The effortless Rat Pack presence. The Vegas icon. On screen and on stage, Martin appeared to embody a new integrated Hollywood, where talent transcended race and friendship crossed every boundary segregation had constructed. The appearances alongside Sammy Davis Jr. suggested genuine brotherhood. The Dean Martin Show ran for 264 episodes from 1965 to 1974. Across all of those episodes, across 9 seasons of American television during a period when the industry was slowly beginning to integrate, Martin never had a single black guest host. After Martin's death in 1995, Carson did something almost unprecedented in entertainment. In a 1998 interview, he broke the code of silence that protected celebrity images even in death, and stated directly that Dean had racial attitudes that would shock people, that everyone in the industry knew it, and that nobody had talked about it publicly. The silence of his colleagues, Carson concluded, was almost as damaging as Martin's racism itself. Number 3. Charlton Heston. Charlton Heston marched alongside Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1963 March on Washington. The photographs exist. He spoke about that march proudly for years and deployed it as credibility whenever questions about racial justice arose. The march was real. Heston was there. No one disputed it. Recalled that in the 1960s, Heston talked about his civil rights participation with genuine passion. By the 1990s, his language had hardened so completely, it was like watching someone slowly reveal who they had always been. Carson's summary: Heston proved that marching for justice once does not make you just. The distance between the march in 1963 and the NRA speeches of the 1990s was the longest and most disturbing journey Carson had ever watched anyone in the industry take. Number 2. John Ford. 6 Academy Awards for directing. Widely considered the greatest filmmaker American cinema has ever produced. John Ford created the visual language of the American Western, directed John Wayne into mythology, and shaped how generations of Americans understood their own frontier history. More than any other single person in Hollywood, Ford defined what America looked like on screen. And what he put on screen, for decades, regarding Native Americans, was among the most systematically dehumanizing racial portraiture in cinema history. Carson, recalled by a former producer, Ford did not just make movies about the West. He told America what the West meant, and what he told them was that it was a white man's paradise, built on land nobody important was using. That message was still in the cultural water decades after his last film. You cannot show something to 100 million people and then pretend it did not shape how they see the world. Number 1. John Wayne. What separated John Wayne from every other name on this list, what placed him permanently at number 1, was that he did not hide what he believed. He did not use coded language. He did not confide in trusted company while maintaining a public face. He did not express his views in private while performing progressivism on camera. He stated his beliefs openly, on the record, in May of 1971, to Playboy magazine, a national publication he knew millions would read. In final interviews before his death in 1979, he never renounced or apologized for a single word. A former Tonight Show producer recalled Carson's private reaction after the 1974 interview. Carson maintained his professionalism on camera as he always did. Off camera, he told his staff he could not believe America's hero actually believed what he believed. And that the saddest part was not that Wayne said those things. It was that America heard them and loved him anyway. Because that, Carson said, told you more about America than it told you about John Wayne. 30 years, 25 names. Comedians who built empires on blackface. War heroes who gave up colleagues to save themselves. A patriotic singer who recorded racial mockery for children's radio. A crooner who owed everything to black music and refused to stand next to a black musician. Studio heads who decided which faces belonged on screen and which ones did not. Actors who played the moral center of America and opposed equality in their actual lives. A senator who danced with Judy Garland and voted against civil rights. A man who marched with King and became everything King fought against. A director who built the mythology, telling America it was acceptable to erase Native Americans from the story of their own land. A 3-time Oscar winner who danced when King was killed. The coolest man in America who maintained professional segregation on his own television program. And the man who said all of it out loud, on the record, to a national audience, and whom America loved unconditionally anyway. Carson saw all of it, shook their hands, laughed at their jokes, made them look brilliant under his studio lights, and went home knowing exactly who they were when the cameras stopped. Which entry on this list surprised you the most? Was there a name here you expected to find, or one you never expected to see? Tell us in the comments below. And if this kind of deep dive history is what you come here for, subscribe and turn on notifications. There is significantly more of this history still buried, and we are not done uncovering it.